The medieval kitchen was not a place of excitement. It was a room of smoke, shadows, and patience. Long before colorful spices reached most tables, before recipes were written for pleasure, food was something else entirely. It was survival. It was routine. It was repetition so deep that days blended together, each meal tasting almost exactly like the last. Imagine a cold morning in a stone village. The sun has barely risen, and the air smells of damp earth and wood ash. A woman steps into her kitchen, if it can even be called that. It is a single room with a fire pit, a pot hanging from a chain, and sacks of grain stacked against the wall. There is no menu to choose from. There is no question about what will be eaten. There is only one option: porridge. Porridge was the heartbeat of medieval food. Thick, gray, and endlessly filling, it began and ended most days. Made from barley, oats, or rye, it was boiled slowly in water, sometimes milk if the household was lucky. No sugar, no fruit, often no salt, just grain and heat, stirred again and again until it became soft enough to eat. The texture was heavy, clinging to the spoon, clinging to the stomach. It did not excite. It endured. For peasants, porridge was not just breakfast. It was lunch. It was dinner. Leftover porridge would be thinned with water the next day and eaten again. Sometimes it was so old it began to sour, developing a sharp smell that people simply learned to ignore. Hunger was stronger than taste. Bread followed closely behind. Dark bread, dense bread, bread that could break a tooth if baked poorly. This was not the soft white bread of later centuries. Medieval bread for the poor was rough and uneven, filled with bits of husk and stone from the grinding process. Flour was ground between stones, and tiny fragments often ended up in the dough. Over time, this wore down teeth until many adults had little left but pain. Bread was eaten with everything, mostly because there was little else. It soaked up thin soups. It was dipped into water or weak ale. It was carried into fields and eaten dry under the sun. Sometimes it was days old, hard as wood. People would soak it just to make it chewable. Yet even this bread was precious. A bad harvest could mean no bread at all. Vegetables were plain and repetitive. Cabbage was king. Boiled cabbage, stewed cabbage, cabbage mixed with grain. Its smell filled villages, clinging to clothes and walls. Onions and leeks added sharpness, but not variety. Turnips, beans, and peas came and went with the seasons. Fresh vegetables were rare luxuries. Most were dried or boiled until all color and life disappeared from them. Meat was a dream for most people, a rare event tied to holidays or special occasions. When it did appear, it was often tough and heavily salted. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, and without ice or refrigeration, preservation was everything. Salted beef, dried pork, or smoked fish were common, They were harsh on the tongue and thirst-inducing. They were eaten slowly, carefully, because once gone, there was no guarantee of more. Even nobles, surrounded by servants and silver plates, were not spared from boredom. Their tables were larger, their portions heavier, but repetition ruled there too. Stews dominated noble meals, thick brown mixtures of meat, grain, and vegetables cooked together for hours. Spices were expensive, and while nobles used them, they were often added not for flavor, but for status. The taste was still muddy, still heavy, still slow. Water was dangerous. Many people believed it caused illness, and often they were right. Streams were polluted. Wells were shallow. Instead, people drank ale, even children. But this ale was weak, barely alcoholic, and tasted sour and flat. It was another daily constant, another dull companion to dull food. Meals were quiet, focused, practical. There was no excitement in eating, no pleasure in discovery. Food was fuel, nothing more. The same pot simmered day after day, refilled with whatever was available. If something fell in, it stayed. If it burned, it burned. Hunger did not allow for complaints. And yet, within this monotony, something else was growing. A quiet awareness. People dreamed of better meals, richer flavors, softer bread. They listened to travelers' stories of distant lands, where spices flowed like gold and food smelled sweet instead of sour. Those stories felt unreal, almost dangerous to imagine, because once you imagine a better meal, it becomes harder to swallow the one in front of you. And somewhere beyond these gray kitchens and smoky pots, trade routes were slowly opening, carrying not just goods, but the promise of change. Change that would challenge the boredom of medieval food, one unfamiliar ingredient at a time. But before that change arrived, we must stay a little longer in these kitchens, with these pots, and with the foods that shaped entire lives through sameness alone, because the next meal, like the last, is already waiting. The pot never truly emptied in a medieval home. It rested above the fire like a silent witness, always warm, always waiting. Whatever remained from yesterday was the foundation of today. This was called pottage, and it was not a single dish, but a way of life. A thick stew made from whatever could be found, whatever could be spared, and whatever had not yet spoiled. Pottage smelled of smoke and earth. It bubbled slowly, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Grain softened into mush. Vegetables collapsed into shapeless pieces. Meat, when it appeared, was stretched thin, cut into small fragments, so its presence could be felt longer than it lasted. The flavor was dull, not because people lacked skill, but because they lacked choice. Every morning, someone stirred the pot, not gently, not lovingly, but mechanically. Stirring kept it from burning. Stirring kept it alive. A crust often formed on top, thick and gray. This crust was pushed aside, and eaten anyway. Nothing was wasted. Waste was hunger wearing a mask. Children grew up tasting the same thing every day. They learned the texture before they learned words. Warm, thick, slightly sour. The taste of boiled grain became comfort and boredom at the same time. It filled the stomach, but left the mind untouched. In winter, pottage grew darker and heavier. Fresh vegetables disappeared. What remained were dried peas, beans, and onions. These were soaked, boiled, and boiled again until they surrendered. The smell was stronger in winter kitchens, trapped by closed doors and small windows. Smoke mixed with food until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Salt was precious. Too much salt meant thirst. Too little meant rot. People learned balance through experience, not recipes. Most meals were under-seasoned by modern standards. Pepper and cinnamon existed, but only in stories for most. The average medieval peasant would never taste them in an entire lifetime. Bread remained the anchor of every meal. It was broken, never cut, and shared among family members. The crusts were hardest, often saved for last. Some bread was baked so dense it could be reused. Old bread became trenchers, thick slabs used as plates. Sauce and stew soaked into them during the meal, and afterward, the trencher was eaten or given to the poor. Even plates were food. Dairy added small moments of relief. Milk, when available, was drunk quickly before it spoiled. More often, it became cheese. Hard, sharp cheese that aged poorly and smelled strongly. Butter was rare and usually reserved for special days. Most cooking fat came from animal grease, rendered and reused until it darkened and thickened. Fish was more common than meat, especially on fasting days. The church required many meatless days, sometimes nearly half the year. Fish filled the gap, but it was rarely fresh. Salted herring and dried cod traveled well and lasted long. They also tasted harsh and overwhelming. People soaked them for hours to remove the salt, but they never truly softened. The smell lingered on hands and clothes. For the poor, food did not change with mood or desire. It changed only with survival. A good harvest meant thicker bread. A bad one meant thinner soup. Famine hovered like a shadow. Everyone knew its shape. Everyone feared it. Even in towns, where markets offered more variety, boredom ruled. Spices were too expensive. Fruit was seasonal and short-lived. Apples and berries came briefly, then vanished. Most fruit was eaten quickly or preserved badly. Rotten fruit was common. Mold was scraped away and the rest eaten. Food was eaten slowly, not for pleasure, but to make it last. Meals were social, but conversation often revolved around work, weather, and worry. Eating was a pause in labor, not a celebration. Yet even in this endless repetition, small changes began to whisper their way into kitchens. A A new grain here, a new method there, not enough to transform meals, but enough to remind people that food could be different. Travelers returned with strange stories of rice eaten in distant lands, of sweet sauces and bright colors. Merchants carried dried fruits and unfamiliar herbs, though few could afford them. Curiosity grew quietly, like hunger that could not be satisfied by pottage alone. And while the pot continued to simmer, while bread continued to harden and soften again, something unseen was approaching. Not a feast, not yet, but a shift, a slow turning of taste, driven not by comfort, but by necessity, faith, and the reach of distant worlds, because medieval food was about to face a powerful force that would shape meals just as deeply as hunger ever had. A force that dictated what could be eaten, when, and why. And that force waited at the center of every table, silent but absolute. The church watched every medieval table, even when no priest was present. It watched through rules, through calendars, through fear of sin. Food was never just food. It was obedience. It was discipline. It was a test repeated again and again, day after day, year after year. Fasting days shaped medieval diets more than taste ever did. Nearly half the year was marked by restrictions. No meat on Fridays. No meat during Lent. No meat on countless holy days honoring saints most people could not even name. For the poor, this barely mattered. Meat was rare anyway, but for those who could afford it, fasting was a constant interruption, a forced return to blandness. On fasting days, kitchens smelled different. The rich scent of fat disappeared. Fires burned lower. Fish replaced meat, but fish was not the fresh catch of shining scales and clean flesh. It was salted, dried, smoked until stiff. Herring arrived in barrels, gray and sharp-smelling. Cod hung like wood, hard and pale. These fish traveled far, fed cities, and bored generations. People soaked fish overnight, sometimes longer, hoping to soften it. They boiled it, mashed it, mixed it into pottage. Still, the taste remained stubborn. Salty, flat, heavy. It filled the stomach, but left the mouth dry. Ale followed, always ale, to wash it down. Eggs were sometimes forbidden too. Milk, butter, cheese, all banned on strict fasting days. This left kitchens strangely empty. Grain and vegetables took over completely. Pottage grew thinner. Bread grew more important. Hunger sharpened. Yet people adapted. They always did. Clever cooks found loopholes. Fish that looked like meat. Almond milk replaced cow's milk. Almonds were ground and mixed with water, creating a pale liquid used in soups and sauces. It was expensive, but among the wealthy, it became a symbol of religious devotion mixed with quiet indulgence. Even sugar, rare and precious, was sometimes used in these almond dishes, creating a strange sweetness that felt almost sinful. But sugar was medicine then, not pleasure. Or at least that was the excuse. For most people, fasting meant endurance. It meant eating less of the same dull food. It meant accepting hunger as holy. Children learned early that discomfort could be sacred, that wanting more was dangerous. Markets changed with the calendar. Butchers closed during Lent. Fishmongers thrived. Prices shifted. Fresh food disappeared. Preservation ruled again. Salt returned as king. And yet, fasting days blurred together. One fish tasted like the next. One bowl of grain felt identical to the last. The church promised spiritual reward, but the body felt only sameness. Food boredom was not accidental. It was enforced. Pleasure was suspicious. Enjoyment too closely resembled temptation. Eating well meant eating carefully, quietly, without excitement. Excess was sin. Simplicity was virtue. Still, humans are human. They whispered complaints. They dreamed of feast days when rules relaxed and meat returned. Christmas, Easter, weddings. These moments burned brightly in memory because they broke the pattern. On feast days, tables changed. Meat returned heavy and glorious. Roasted pork, beef, goose, fat dripped, smells filled halls. But even these feasts followed familiar structures. Stews, boiled dishes, thick sauces. Spices masked aging meat more than they enhanced flavor. Even celebration carried the weight of habit. After the feast, boredom returned quickly. Leftovers stretched thin. Salt reclaimed control. The pot resumed its endless simmer. Monks lived this cycle more intensely than anyone. Monasteries followed strict dietary rules. Silence during meals. Simple food. No choice. No pleasure. Bread, beans, vegetables, and water or weak ale. Monastic food was famously dull, designed to quiet desire. Yet monasteries also preserved knowledge. They recorded food practices. They experimented quietly. Some monks brewed better ale. Some cultivated herbs. Small sparks of change flickered behind stone walls. Outside, trade routes expanded. Ships crossed seas carrying not just fish, but stories. Crusaders returned from distant lands with memories of rice, citrus, spices that burned and sweetened at the same time. Most people would never taste these things, but the idea of them mattered. Ideas are dangerous when food is boring. Because once people learn that meals can be different, rules begin to feel heavier. Fasting begins to feel longer. Pottage begins to feel like a prison. And as the medieval world slowly opened to distant influences, a quiet tension grew between obedience and appetite, between tradition and curiosity, between the food people were told to eat and the food they secretly wanted. That tension would soon find its way into kitchens, into markets, and into the very way medieval people thought about taste itself. And when that happened, Boredom would no longer be accepted so easily. Hunger sharpened the senses, but monotony dulled them again. Medieval people lived between these two states, always aware of food, yet rarely excited by it. Seasons ruled everything. What could be eaten depended entirely on the time of year, and most of the year offered very little variety. Spring was thin and cruel. Winter stores ran low, and fields had not yet produced anything new. This was the season of the hungry gap. Bread grew smaller. Pottage grew watery. People gathered wild greens, nettles, and herbs from the edges of fields and forests. These were boiled until soft, losing most of their flavor, but they kept people alive. The bitterness of wild plants became familiar, even expected. Summer brought relief, but not luxury. Vegetables returned, but they were simple and repetitive. Beans, peas, cabbage, onions. The same crops grown again and again because they were reliable, not because they were loved. Fresh food was eaten quickly before it spoiled. There was no time to enjoy abundance. Preservation always came first. Autumn was work, endless work. Fruits and vegetables were dried, salted, or pickled badly. Meat from slaughtered animals was preserved in salt or smoke. This was the last chance to prepare for winter. Meals during autumn were hurried and practical. No one lingered over taste. Every bite reminded them of the months ahead. Winter returned the kitchen to darkness. Fires burned constantly, but food felt heavier, slower. Salted meat, dried fish, old grain, vegetables reduced to memory. The smell of storage filled homes, musty and sour. Meals became something to endure rather than enjoy. Spices could have changed everything, but they were unreachable dreams. Pepper was worth its weight in silver. Cinnamon came from lands most people would never see. Cloves, nutmeg, ginger, all distant, all expensive, all symbols of power rather than pleasure. When nobles used spices, they often used them excessively, dumping them into dishes to show wealth. The result was not balance, but confusion. Strong, strange flavors layered over already dull food. For the poor, herbs were the only seasoning. Parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary. These were grown near homes or gathered wild. They added faint aroma, not transformation. A handful of herbs might lift a dish slightly, but never enough to erase boredom. Cooking methods remained limited. Boiling dominated everything. Roasting required large amounts of fuel and was reserved for special occasions. Frying was rare and greasy. Baking was communal. Villages shared ovens, and bread was baked in batches. This meant bread recipes stayed the same for generations. Change was slow, discouraged by habit and necessity. Texture mattered more than flavor. Food needed to fill the stomach and stay there. Thin food meant hunger returned quickly. Thick food meant survival. This is why medieval meals were heavy, dense, and often unpleasant by modern standards. Children learned early that eating was not optional. Refusal meant punishment or starvation. Taste did not matter. Complaints were useless. Food was respected because it was scarce, not because it was good. Illness was common, and food was often blamed. People believed certain foods caused imbalance in the body. Hot and cold foods, dry and wet foods. Diet was tied to medieval medicine. Eating the wrong thing at the wrong time was thought to cause disease. This made people cautious, even fearful of new foods. So boredom became safety. Familiar meals felt predictable. Predictable meant less risk. A new ingredient might excite curiosity, but it also carried danger. Poison, illness, sin. Hunger taught people to trust what they knew. And yet, cracks were forming. Cities grew larger. Markets became busier. Trade increased slowly, steadily. Foreign merchants brought dried fruits, rice, sugar, and spices into Europe in small amounts. At first, these items were medicine, then symbols, eventually temptations. People who tasted something new never forgot it. A single spoon of sweetened almond milk, a hint of spice in a noble's kitchen, a dried fig brought by a traveler. These moments lingered in memory far longer than thousands of bowls of pottage. Food boredom did something strange. It made people dream. They dreamed of meals that surprised them, of bread that was soft, of meat that was fresh, of flavors that woke the tongue instead of numbing it. These dreams were quiet, but they spread, because once boredom becomes visible, once people realize that food does not have to be this way, change becomes inevitable. Slowly, unevenly, and often resisted, medieval food was beginning to shift. And in the spaces between hunger and habit, between fear and curiosity, a new relationship with food was forming, one that would not erase boredom overnight, but would challenge it in ways medieval kitchens had never seen before. That challenge would come not from peasants or priests, but from power, wealth, and the desire to impress. And it would reshape even the dullest meals in unexpected ways. Power ate differently, but not always better. In castles and great halls, medieval food became a performance. Yet beneath the spectacle, boredom still lingered. The tables were longer, the dishes heavier, the servants more numerous, but the flavors often remained stubbornly familiar. Wealth could buy abundance, but it could not always buy imagination. A noble feast began long before the first bite. Animals were slaughtered. Fires roared. Kitchens filled with noise and urgency. Large cauldrons boiled. Spits turned slowly, and cooks shouted over the crackling flames. To an outsider, it looked like excess. To those inside, it was routine. The food arrived in waves, course after course, not to provide variety, but to display status. Whole animals appeared, roasted and decorated. Peacocks were cooked, then redressed in their feathers to look alive again. Swans were served with wings spread wide. These dishes were meant to impress the eyes, not the tongue. The taste, however, was often disappointing. Meat was overcooked to ensure safety. Spices were poured on heavily, not blended carefully. Sweet and savory collided without harmony. Sugar mixed with meat. Vinegar sharpened already harsh flavors. The result was overwhelming, not pleasurable. Stews still dominated noble tables. Thick, brown, familiar. Beef stewed with onions and herbs. Mutton boiled until soft. Sauces thickened with breadcrumbs instead of flour. Everything leaned toward heaviness. Everything sat in the stomach like stone. Bread was still everywhere, though whiter and softer than peasant loaves. White bread became a symbol of class. The poor ate dark bread, the rich ate pale. Yet even this bread lacked excitement. It was fresh, yes, but bland. Butter and honey sometimes helped, but not enough to transform it. Vegetables were treated as supporting actors, not stars. Cabbage appeared again, even in castles. Carrots were pale and bitter, nothing like the sweet versions of today. Greens were boiled until limp. Color drained away, leaving plates dominated by browns and grays. Food was eaten with hands. Knives were shared. Forks were rare and suspicious. Grease-coated fingers. Napkins were used sparingly. Meals lasted hours, not because people enjoyed them, but because ceremony demanded it. Eating was slow because it had to be slow. Between courses, entertainment filled the gaps. Music, gestures, stories. These distractions mattered because the food alone could not hold attention. Without performance, even the richest meal became dull. Leftovers were immense. Nobles rarely finished what was served. Excess food was given to servants or the poor, spreading the same flavors downward. What was impressive one day became monotonous the next. Even kings grew tired of repetition. Chronicles mention complaints about food, about the same meats served again and again. Beef, pork, mutton, goose, rarely anything else. Hunting added excitement, but not variety. Wild game tasted different, but it was still meat, still roasted, still familiar. Sweet dishes offered brief escape. Tarts filled with dried fruit. Custards thickened with eggs and milk. These were precious moments of contrast. But sugar was expensive, and sweetness remained limited. Desserts were rare, not expected. Alcohol flowed freely. Wine for the rich, ale for everyone else. Wine masked flavors, dulled criticism. It helped people endure long meals and long lives of similar tastes. Power did not free people from boredom. It simply dressed boredom in gold. Meanwhile, beyond castle walls, cities were growing. Markets buzzed. Merchants counted coins. Trade routes stretched farther each year. Slowly, very slowly, new ingredients became more common. Rice entered European kitchens. Sugar became slightly less rare. Spices trickled downward, diluted and imitated. Cookbooks began to appear, written for those who could read and afford to experiment. These books did not aim to make food delicious. They aimed to make it impressive. Recipes focused on color, on presentation, on symbolism. Taste remained secondary. Still, something was changing. The idea that food could be planned, adjusted, refined began to take hold. Cooks started thinking in terms of combinations instead of survival. Even boredom began to be questioned. But for every new idea, tradition pushed back. Old habits were comfortable. Familiar food felt safe. Change threatened balance, both physical and spiritual. So medieval food stood at a crossroads, between hunger and abundance, between repetition and experimentation, between obedience and desire. The pot still simmered in peasant homes. The feast still stretched endlessly in noble halls. And yet, across both worlds, a quiet dissatisfaction grew. A shared weariness of sameness. That weariness would not explode suddenly. It would seep into kitchens, one ingredient at a time, carried by merchants, travelers, and ambition. And with it would come not joy, not yet, but curiosity. Because curiosity is dangerous when food has been boring for centuries. Curiosity moved faster than hunger. It slipped through ports and marketplaces, through whispered conversations and half-forgotten stories. Medieval food did not change overnight. But once people began to wonder, boredom could no longer fully satisfy them. Trade reshaped the medieval table quietly, not with feasts, but with small disruptions. A bag of rice appearing in a market, a handful of dried figs, a pinch of spice sold at a price that made buyers hesitate. These ingredients did not replace porridge or bread. They interrupted them. Rice was strange to Europeans at first. Small, pale grains that behaved differently from barley or oats. It required more water, more care. It was often overcooked into paste, losing whatever charm it once had. Still, it represented something new, something foreign, something that did not taste exactly like yesterday. Sugar followed a similar path. It was not yet the sweet foundation of desserts. It was medicine, or at least treated as such, mixed into sauces, sprinkled sparingly, used to balance bitterness rather than create pleasure. Sugar made dishes confusing rather than exciting, but confusion itself was a break from boredom. Spices traveled far, but arrived tired and expensive. Pepper, ginger, cloves, and cinnamon were often old by the time they reached Europe. Their flavors dulled by time and storage. When added to food, they sometimes shocked the tongue, sometimes vanished entirely. Cooks used them anyway, not for harmony, but for meaning. Spices meant wealth. They meant connection to the wider world. For common people, these changes barely touched daily meals. Pottage remained king. Bread remained law. But awareness spread. People knew there was more. Even if they could not afford it, they could imagine it. Markets became places of temptation. Stalls displayed dried fruit from distant lands, nuts with unfamiliar shapes, jars of preserved sweetness. The poor walked past them slowly, memorizing smells, memorizing colors. Memory became a substitute for taste. Cooking knowledge expanded slowly. Travelers shared techniques. Merchants spoke of foods eaten elsewhere. Crusaders returned changed, not just by war, but by meals they had tasted. Rice dishes, flatbreads, spiced meats. Many of these memories were exaggerated, but exaggeration fueled desire. Fear remained strong. New food could unbalance the body. Medieval medicine warned against excess, against novelty. Physicians advised moderation and familiarity. They believed the body thrived on routine. This reinforced boring diets, even as curiosity pushed against them. Monasteries continued to experiment quietly. Herb gardens grew more complex. Brewing improved. Ale became more consistent. Small improvements mattered. Better ale meant better meals, even if food stayed the same. Urban life encouraged experimentation. Cities mixed people from different regions. Recipes collided. Ingredients substituted. One cook tried something another had mentioned. Mistakes were common. Success was rare, but attempts increased. Still, the average meal remained dull. Change was uneven, slow, and often disappointing. A new ingredient added to an old dish did not magically transform it. Rice boiled without seasoning was still bland. Sugar misused made food cloying. Spices thrown together created chaos. Boredom adapted. It absorbed novelty and continued. Yet something fundamental had shifted. People began to think of food as something that could improve. That idea alone was revolutionary. Once food becomes a subject of thought, it becomes a subject of desire. And desire does not fade easily. As medieval society continued to grow more connected, the gap between what people ate and what they knew was possible widened. That gap created tension, frustration, aspiration, because when people know there is more, they begin to resent having less. And as this resentment simmered, quietly and steadily, medieval food moved closer to a moment where boredom would no longer be enough, where taste would begin to matter not just to the powerful, but to everyone. That moment was not yet here, but it was approaching, carried on the backs of traders, sealed in barrels, whispered in kitchens, and imagined in empty bowls. The medieval kitchen was a place of waiting, waiting for water to boil, waiting for grain to soften, waiting for hunger to quiet itself. Hours passed in front of fires that never truly rested, and in those hours, food became less about taste and more about time. Meals were slow because cooking was slow, and that slowness shaped how people understood eating itself. When every dish took effort and patience, excitement felt unnecessary, even suspicious. In peasant homes, cooking followed the same rhythm every day, a rhythm that rarely broke. A pot was hung above the fire at dawn and rarely removed. Ingredients were added as they became available, not as recipes demanded. A handful of grain, a chopped onion, a wilted cabbage leaf, perhaps a bone saved from weeks earlier, boiled again and again until it surrendered whatever flavor remained. The pot was stirred not to improve taste, but to prevent disaster. Burning meant waste, and waste meant hunger. Over time, everything in the pot began to taste the same. Past meals lingered in the next, blending into one continuous flavor that people stopped noticing entirely. Children grew into this sameness without question. Their memories of food were not marked by special dishes, but by absence. The absence of hunger on good days, the absence of enough on bad ones. Flavor did not define childhood. Fullness did. When they became adults, they passed this understanding forward, teaching the next generation that food was something to endure, not enjoy. Boredom became tradition, inherited like land or debt. Even celebrations struggled to escape monotony. Weddings, births, and religious holidays promised feasts, but those feasts relied on the same ingredients prepared in slightly larger quantities. More bread, thicker stews, extra meat, often boiled or roasted in familiar ways. The difference was not taste, but volume. People ate until they were uncomfortably full, because abundance itself was the luxury. Once the event ended, leftovers returned to the daily routine, stretching celebration into dull continuity. Urban kitchens, though closer to markets and trade, were not immune. Space was limited. Fuel was expensive. Cooking had to be efficient. Boiling remained dominant. Frying filled homes with smoke and danger. Baking required access to ovens and careful timing. Most cooks chose safety and familiarity over experimentation. Failure was costly, and medieval life did not reward risk easily. The idea of following a recipe was still foreign to most. Cooking knowledge was passed orally, learned by watching and repeating. Enough grain, not too much water. Cook until it looks right. These vague instructions preserved consistency, but crushed creativity. Each cook aimed to replicate what had come before, not improve it. Improvement implied dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction implied ingratitude. Food boredom extended beyond taste into the body itself. Diets heavy in grain and lacking in variety led to fatigue and illness. People accepted this as normal. Weakness was life. Sickness was fate. Rarely did anyone suspect food itself could be responsible. When illness struck, blame fell on whether sin or imbalance, not on the endless bowls of the same meals. Smell became more important than flavor. Kitchens were judged by whether food smelled spoiled or safe. If it did not offend the nose, it was eaten. Mold was scraped away. Sourness tolerated. The line between edible and dangerous was thin and constantly shifting. Taste was not trusted, survival was. As trade increased, glimpses of other food cultures began to unsettle this acceptance. A merchant describing spiced rice eaten in distant ports. A sailor recalling sweet fruits preserved in honey. These stories sounded almost fictional, yet they planted seeds. People began to imagine meals that did not rely on endurance alone. Still, imagination was restrained by fear. New foods were foreign, and foreign meant risky. Medieval people lived in a world where a single mistake could be fatal. Poison was a real threat. Illness spread quickly. Trusting unfamiliar ingredients felt reckless, so curiosity remained cautious, slow, hesitant. Boredom became a shield. Familiar meals felt predictable. Predictability meant control in a life filled with uncertainty. Changing food meant inviting chaos into the home. Many preferred dull safety to exciting danger. Yet, even shields crack under pressure. As cities grew richer and trade more common, food boredom became harder to ignore. People compared meals across households. They noticed differences. Some bread was softer. Some ale tasted better. Some stews smelled richer. Small variations sparked quiet envy. Gradually, cooks began making tiny adjustments. An extra herb, a longer boil, a different grain. These changes were subtle, almost invisible, but they mattered. They signaled the beginning of choice. Choice is powerful. Once people realize they can choose how food tastes, boredom becomes a decision rather than a destiny. Medieval kitchens were not yet ready to embrace this fully, but the awareness had begun to spread. And as this awareness grew, it carried with it a dangerous thought. If food could change, perhaps other things could too. Tradition loosened its grip slightly. Habit wavered. The pot still simmered. The bread still baked. The meals still repeated. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. A slow, quiet transformation driven not by hunger, but by the refusal to accept boredom forever. That refusal would soon meet resistance, not from poverty or fear, but from authority itself. Because when food changes, power notices. Authority did not like change at the table. Food was order, and order was control. Kings, churches, guilds, and households all understood that what people ate shaped how they lived and how they thought. A predictable diet meant a predictable population. Boring food kept life narrow, focused, contained. Laws quietly guarded this sameness. Sumptuary laws dictated who could eat could use spices, who could serve certain dishes. These rules were not just about class, they were about boundaries. A peasant eating like a noble was unsettling. It blurred lines that society depended on. Food was a visible marker of place, and boredom was part of that marker. Guilds controlled baking, brewing, and butchering in towns. They set standards, but those standards favored consistency over creativity. Bread had to look a certain way. Ale had to taste familiar. Anything unusual raised suspicion. Innovation threatened stability, and stability mattered more than pleasure. Households enforced food discipline too. Parents taught children not to ask for more. Servants ate what they were given when they were told. Complaints were signs of weakness or disobedience. Gratitude was expected, even when meals were dull and repetitive. Silence at the table was common, especially in religious homes. Eating was not entertainment, it was duty. The church continued to shape taste through morality. Rich food tempted the soul. Strong flavors stirred desire. Simplicity kept the spirit clean. Boring meals were not failures, they were virtues. To want more was to risk sin. This belief ran deep, shaping how people judged their own hunger. Even among the wealthy, restraint was praised publicly, even if ignored privately. A noble might feast lavishly, but speak proudly of moderation. Publicly rejecting excess mattered more than actually doing so. Food became performance again, but now performance of humility. Medical theory reinforced this control. Physicians warned that rich food overheated the body. Spices inflamed passions. Sugar weakened balance. Plain food was safer. Familiar food was healthier. These ideas justified boredom with authority and reason. Taste became something to fear rather than explore. And yet, the world outside Europe continued to press inward. Trade did not ask permission. Goods arrived regardless of laws. Spices entered kitchens quietly. Sugar slipped into sauces. Rice appeared more often. Authority could slow change, but it could not stop it. Cooks learned to adapt without drawing attention. They did not announce new flavors. They blended them subtly. A pinch of spice here, a touch of sweetness there. Enough to change the dish, not enough to scandalize. Boredom was challenged carefully, respectfully. People noticed, even if they did not speak of it. Meals began to feel slightly different. Not exciting, but less heavy, less numbing. A faint sense that food could do more than fill space in the stomach. This created a quiet conflict. Tradition demanded sameness. Experience suggested improvement. Most people lived between these forces, uncertain, cautious. They did not rebel. They adjusted. Food boredom did not vanish. It evolved. It became less absolute, more fragile. The old pot still simmered, but it no longer tasted exactly the same every day. As generations passed, this subtle shift accumulated. What once felt radical became normal. What once tasted strange became expected. Authority adapted, rewriting rules, redefining moderation. By the late medieval period, food was still simple, still repetitive, still often dull. But it was no longer unquestioned. People knew boredom was not inevitable, that knowledge mattered more than flavor itself. Because once boredom is recognized as something imposed, it loses its power. And as medieval society moved closer to profound transformation, as cities grew louder and ideas traveled faster, the table became a quiet battlefield, not of rebellion, but of preference, of taste, of choice. The final years of medieval food would not end in excitement or abundance, but in transition. A slow leaving behind of pure endurance and a hesitant step toward enjoyment. That step would lead into a new age, one where food would begin to tell different stories. Stories not just of survival, but of identity. And those stories were already forming, bite by bite, in kitchens that no longer accepted boredom as destiny. By the late medieval world, boredom had become familiar enough that people began to name it, even if only in their thoughts. Meals were still repetitive, still heavy, still bound by habit, but something subtle had changed. People were no longer blind to it. They noticed when food tasted the same. They remembered when it tasted different. Cities grew louder and more crowded. Markets expanded. Taverns multiplied. Food was no longer eaten only at home or in great halls. People began to eat among strangers. This mattered. When you eat beside others, comparison becomes unavoidable. One person's bread is softer. Another's ale is clearer. A stew smells richer at the next table. Boredom becomes relative. Taverns did not offer luxury, but they offered escape. Ale was brewed with more care, not because brewers wanted to be artists, but because customers noticed differences. A good ale brought people back. A bad one emptied benches. For the first time, taste began to influence survival, not just fullness. Street food appeared quietly. Small pies, fried dough, roasted nuts. Simple things, but different from the pot at home. These foods were not healthier or richer, but they broke routine. They were eaten quickly, standing in noise and movement. Context made them feel special. Even boring food tastes better when it is not expected. Bread diversified slightly. Bakers experimented with shape and texture. Some added seeds, some mixed grains. The changes were small, but meaningful. People chose where to buy bread based on preference, not just proximity. Choice crept in. Cookbooks became more common among the literate. These texts did not speak to peasants, but ideas traveled downward. Servants learned new methods. Urban cooks adapted noble recipes to simpler ingredients. The results were uneven, but effort increased. Food also became a marker of identity. Regions developed reputations. One town was known for its bread, another for its ale, another for its cheese. Pride formed around these foods, even if they remained simple. Boredom softened when food became part of who you were. Medical thinking shifted slightly. Diet was still about balance, but enjoyment was no longer always condemned. Moderation remained important, but total denial began to feel excessive. Pleasure found a cautious place at the table. The church's grip loosened, not suddenly, but gradually. Rules remained, but enforcement weakened. People interpreted fasting more flexibly. Fish dishes became more creative. Almond milk sauces grew richer. Even restriction invited invention. Still, the old patterns remained strong. Pottage did not disappear. Bread remained central. Most people still ate the same foods most days of their lives. Change did not erase boredom, it reshaped it. What had once been complete monotony became a baseline, interrupted occasionally by difference. Those interruptions mattered. They kept boredom from settling completely. As medieval society approached its end, food stood on the edge of transformation. Not because people suddenly learned to cook better, but because they began to care. Care changes everything. Once people care about food, they talk about it. They judge it. They remember it. Boring food can survive hunger, tradition, and authority. It cannot survive attention, and attention was growing. The medieval table, once a place of endurance, was becoming a place of expectation. Quiet expectation, cautious expectation, but expectation nonetheless. The age that followed would not erase simplicity, but it would redefine it. Boredom would no longer be a virtue. It would become a problem to solve. And as the medieval world slowly gave way to something new, the last echoes of its food culture lingered. In heavy stews, in dark bread, in habits passed down unconsciously, those echoes would shape the future, reminding people where they came from, even as they reached for something different. The story of boring medieval food does not end with excitement or relief. It ends with awareness, with the understanding that even the dullest traditions carry meaning, and that meaning would carry forward into a world that was ready to taste more than survival. The medieval world did not wake up one morning and decide that food should be better. Change arrived the way it always had, quietly, unevenly, almost unnoticed. The old meals remained on the table, but they no longer stood alone. They were joined by memory, comparison, and expectation, and those invisible companions altered everything. Pottage was still eaten, bread was still broken, ale was still poured, but these acts were no longer empty rituals of survival. People remembered other tastes now. A richer stew eaten at a tavern, a softer loaf bought from a skilled baker, a hint of spice tasted once and never forgotten. Memory followed every meal, sitting beside the bowl like a silent judge. For peasants, life remained hard. Food was still simple, repetitive, and often dull. But even among the poorest, habits had shifted slightly. When possible, they chose better grain. They noticed when ale was brewed well. They favored cooks who handled food with care. These were small decisions, but they mattered. Choice, however limited, weakened boredom's grip. In towns, food became part of daily rhythm rather than pure necessity. People planned meals when they could. They saved coins for occasional treats. They shared opinions. Complaints, once rare and dangerous, became common. This stew is thin. That bread is dry. The ale tastes sour today. Speaking these thoughts aloud was itself a transformation. Nobles continued to feast, but feasts changed. Excess remained, but refinement crept in. Spices were used with more intention. Sauces became smoother. Presentation mattered less than balance. The desire to impress shifted from quantity to quality, slowly, imperfectly, but clearly. The church adapted as well. Fasting rules remained, but interpretation softened. Fish dishes grew more varied. Almond milk became richer. Even restriction became an opportunity for creativity. Boredom, once praised as spiritual discipline, became something to manage rather than embrace. Medical thinking evolved. Physicians still warned against excess, but they began to accept that pleasure had value. Food was no longer just fuel or medicine. It was experience. The body was not only something to control, but something to satisfy carefully. Trade continued to expand, bringing more ingredients into reach. Sugar became less rare. Rice became more familiar. Spices flowed more freely. These ingredients did not instantly transform medieval meals, but they changed expectations. People knew what was possible, and possibility reshaped desire. Yet the medieval table never became exciting in the way modern tables are. There were no sudden explosions of flavor, no dramatic revolutions in taste. Instead, there was a slow leaving behind of total sameness. Boredom did not disappear. It loosened. And that loosening marked the end of an era. The medieval relationship with food had been defined by endurance, by repetition, accepted as fate, by meals that filled the body but left the senses untouched. As the Middle Ages faded, that relationship shifted toward awareness, toward curiosity, toward quiet dissatisfaction. What followed would build on this foundation. Renaissance kitchens would experiment more boldly. Global exploration would flood Europe with new tastes. Sugar would sweeten not just food, but expectation itself. But none of that would have been possible without centuries of boredom that trained people to notice change. Boring medieval food did more than feed bodies. It shaped patience. It taught endurance. It created hunger not just for calories, but for difference. It made flavor meaningful by withholding it. Even today, echoes remain. In stews that comfort rather than excite. In bread that feels honest and heavy. In meals that speak of survival more than pleasure. These foods carry memory, whether we recognize it or not. The medieval table reminds us that food does not begin as art. It begins as need. And only when need is met again and again does the question arise. Can this be more? That question, born in smoky kitchens and endless pots, marked the true end of medieval food. Not with a feast, not with celebration, but with a quiet realization. Eating did not have to be boring forever. By the turn of the late Middle Ages, the act of eating had become a silent, pervasive ritual that shaped the rhythm of daily life in ways most people did not even realize. Each household, each hearth, each steaming pot of pottage or hard loaf of bread carried with it centuries of repetition, of lessons in endurance, of habits honed by scarcity and reinforced by tradition. People did not eat for pleasure, they ate because not eating meant suffering. Hunger was immediate, relentless, and familiar. Boredom, however, was slow, subtle, and far more insidious. It seeped into every bite, coloring the way people perceived their meals, even the meals of the wealthy. Those who could afford variety still often found themselves trapped by the limits of what was customary, what was expected, and what was considered virtuous. The medieval palate was not lazy, it was disciplined. It had been trained for generations to accept monotony as normal. The same grayish bread, the same bland pottage, boiled greens with a faint herb or a stubborn bone for flavor. Salted fish that had traveled for weeks, even months, across harsh landscapes. Meat, when available, boiled rather than roasted, heavy and unseasoned. Preserved through necessity rather than innovation. The palate adapted, numbed almost entirely to flavor, finding comfort instead in texture and familiarity. People grew to savor the simple knowledge that they would not starve that day, even if that meant swallowing bowl after bowl of near indistinguishable meals. Yet even in the gray monotony of daily sustenance, the medieval imagination was restless. Stories of distant lands traveled with traders, with pilgrims, with crusaders returning from journeys across the seas. Tales of cinnamon, clove, pepper, and ginger, of sugar that could sweeten even the bitterest potage, began to enter the consciousness of those who had never seen them. A handful of dried fruit in a noble's kitchen, a pinch of saffron in a monastery stew. Even the pale luxury of almond milk stirred curiosity and desire. People remembered these tastes, sometimes exaggerating them in retellings. Memory became a kind of seasoning all its own, a spice that lingered long after the meal was finished. The imagination, fueled by scarcity and monotony, began to fill in the blanks. Hunger was no longer merely physical, it became aspirational. People wondered, silently, what a meal could truly be. This curiosity spread slowly, quietly, often unnoticed. In urban centers, where markets grew denser and trade more regular, glimpses of the extraordinary began to challenge the ordinary. Bakers experimented with seeds, grains, and shapes. Brewers refined their ales, learning subtle techniques that distinguished one batch from another. Tavern owners introduced small novelties, pies with unusual fillings, roasted nuts, sweetened drinks, or rare dried fruits, just enough to break the monotony without inviting accusation. Patrons noticed these differences immediately, discussing them quietly among themselves, praising one dish and avoiding another. For the first time, taste carried social power, however modest. People began to judge food not only by its ability to satisfy hunger, but by its quality, its novelty, its pleasure. Even monasteries, bastions of strict routine and self-denial, could not resist gradual adaptation. Monks experimented with herbs more extensively, growing complex gardens to supplement their austere meals. Ale became more consistent, both in flavor and strength. Simple bread was baked with subtle variations. These minor improvements did not overthrow the underlying monotony of monastic life, but they created small windows of surprise, quiet moments when taste could break free. Even if briefly, those moments, carefully measured and rare, became whispers of possibility. Yet the social and spiritual pressures remained immense. Sumptuary laws, religious edicts, and medical beliefs all conspired to maintain control over what people ate. Excess, particularly in taste, was dangerous. Too much spice could inflame the passions. Sugar could weaken the body and the spirit. Rich food tempted greed and gluttony. Those who dared to experiment openly risked censure, not only from their superiors, but from society itself. This is why change crept forward slowly, in whispers and secret adjustments, rather than bold revolutions of taste. Culinary curiosity had to navigate a maze of authority, morality, and tradition. Food boredom, however, had sown a quiet rebellion of its own. Once people realized that meals could differ, once they remembered flavors that contrasted with the dull everyday, dissatisfaction began to take root. This was not the dissatisfaction of revolt or outrage. It was subtler. It was a slow recognition, a mental note that life could be richer than it seemed. A single taste of almond milk sweetened with sugar, a stew with fresh herbs from the market garden, a loaf of bread baked with care and attention. Each small difference reminded people of all the dull meals they had endured, highlighting repetition in a way that could no longer be ignored. And as awareness of these possibilities spread, it generated tension between tradition and novelty, between authority and desire, between endurance and pleasure. People were still expected to eat what they were given, to respect custom and ration, to survive, to fast, to observe, to be virtuous. But now there was an internal, almost invisible struggle. Boredom was no longer just an external condition imposed by scarcity or custom. It had become a challenge, a force to be questioned. It existed in tension with imagination, curiosity, and the quiet longing for something different. This tension was amplified by memory. Medieval people, unlike us, could not rely on books, advertisements, or global trade to remind them of variety. Memory was the vessel of aspiration, a single remarkable meal, whether eaten in a noble hall, on a pilgrim's journey, or offered by a traveling merchant, could linger in the mind for months, even years. The dullness of daily sustenance became sharper in contrast to these remembered flavors. Boredom, once comfortable and expected, began to sting. It reminded people of what they lacked, and it demanded attention. By the end of the medieval period, food had evolved into a complex web of endurance, ritual, desire, and awareness. People still boiled their grain, still ate bland bread, still consumed salted fish and watery pottage. But those acts were no longer entirely unquestioned. The seeds of change had been planted. Boredom had taught patience. Scarcity had taught vigilance. Monotony had trained the mind to recognize difference. And curiosity, once subdued by necessity and authority, was rising steadily, quietly, and irreversibly. The stage was set for a transformation that would not arrive suddenly, but would arrive inevitably. When it came, it would not erase the past. Medieval food, with all its gray, dull, repetitive power, would linger in memory and habit. But it would no longer be the only choice. People had begun to imagine meals differently, to hope for flavor, and to understand that food could do more than merely sustain the body. It could nourish the mind. It could inspire desire. It could become an experience rather than an obligation. And in that slow, almost imperceptible shift, the medieval table began to open its doors to the future. A future where taste mattered, where boredom could be challenged, where the repetition of centuries could give way, piece by piece, to creativity, to choice, and to the quiet, irresistible power of flavor. The last embers of monotony still glowed in the hearths of Europe, but the smoke that rose carried a new scent, one of possibility, of curiosity, and of meals that might, at long last, awaken the senses. The story of boring medieval food had not ended. It was evolving, stretching toward transformation, leaving traces in kitchens, in markets, in hearths, and in the minds of people who had learned, at last, that food could be more than survival. That evolution was not sudden. It was patient, deliberate, and enduring. And from it, the taste of the future began to take shape, slowly, steadily, and irresistibly, in ways that medieval cooks and diners could scarcely imagine, but would come to live and savor, one bite at a time. The late medieval kitchen was both a prison and a laboratory, a paradox few could articulate at the time. Inside stone walls, amid the ceaseless smoke of hearth fires and the clang of iron pots, cooks labored to feed bodies that had learned to survive rather than enjoy. Yet within the monotony, subtle experiments unfolded, often unnoticed, often unrecorded, as if the very act of trying something new required secrecy. Peasants, constrained by poverty and necessity, could only make minor adjustments, adding a few wild herbs, selecting slightly different grains, or boiling vegetables a little longer or shorter. Each variation, however small, was a departure from routine, a tiny rebellion against centuries of sameness. And in the quiet of kitchens across Europe, these tiny acts of defiance accumulated, planting seeds for change that no decree or moral teaching could erase. In the halls of the wealthy, the story was different, but not necessarily better. Nobles had access to ingredients beyond imagination for the common folk. Almonds, dried fruits, sugar, spices carried across continents. They feasted in sight of servants and guests, creating spectacles meant to impress and intimidate. Yet, even in these grand displays, flavor often succumbed to excess. Spices were poured without subtlety. Thick sauces were smothered over meat, and sugar was used as an ornament rather than a seasoning. The eye was entertained, the stomach filled, but taste was frequently overwhelmed, confused, or dulled. Nobility measured success not by enjoyment, but by the visible abundance on the table. Boredom, therefore, persisted even among the richest, hidden beneath the glittering surface of ceremonial meals. For ordinary people, monotony had a profound psychological effect. Daily sustenance was rarely memorable. Bread that was dark and coarse, pottage that was thick and bland, meat that was scarce or tough, all ingrained habits of endurance. Hunger shaped perception. Flavor was secondary. What mattered was that the stomach was full, even partially, and that the family survived another day. But beneath the acceptance lay memory, imagination, and a faint yearning for something different. Even the poorest remembered rare treats: a stolen fig, a bite of sweetened milk, a taste of fish brought from a distant market. These glimpses of difference lingered, intensifying the contrast with everyday meals and teaching the mind to notice what the body had long endured without complaint. Trade was the quiet disruptor of medieval food. Caravans, ships, and merchants carried ingredients and techniques from distant lands. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, sugar from southern Europe, rice from the east. These items arrived slowly and in small quantities, accessible mostly to the wealthy. But the knowledge of their existence permeated society. Stories of these foods traveled further than the goods themselves. carried by travelers, pilgrims, and merchants who spoke of new tastes with awe and exaggeration. The ordinary eater could not taste them daily, but hearing of their possibility stirred curiosity, reshaping desire, and planting the idea that food could be more than survival. Within households, experimentation was subtle but persistent. Cooks adjusted quantities of herbs, altered boiling times, or substituted available ingredients for foreign luxuries. Always carefully, always in moderation. Small shifts, an extra pinch of parsley, a few drops of honey in a sauce, a slightly longer roast created moments of novelty without provoking criticism from tradition or authority. In doing so, cooks became pioneers of taste, invisible and uncelebrated, yet laying the groundwork for culinary evolution. People began to recognize that meals could vary without danger, that flavor could be manipulated, and that small pleasures could exist even in a constrained and controlled diet. Medical and religious doctrines continued to shape behavior, often paradoxically. Physicians preached moderation, warning against indulgence in spices, sugar, and rich meats. Yet they also encouraged proper seasoning to maintain balance and digestion. Monks fasted and abstained for moral reasons. Yet their monasteries became sites of controlled experimentation with herbs, ale, and bread. Authority insisted that boredom was a virtue, that simplicity ensured health and morality. Yet these very constraints created the conditions under which subtle ingenuity could thrive. The tension between control and curiosity defined the medieval table, producing a unique environment where innovation was possible, but careful, measured, and often invisible. Even as curiosity expanded, boredom remained resilient. For every taste of difference, there were hundreds of monotonous meals. The same porridge simmered in the same pots, the same bread baked in communal ovens, the same greens boiled until gray. But awareness had changed everything. People now compared, judged, remembered, and imagined. Meals were no longer simply endured, they were evaluated. Memory and expectation became silent ingredients in every bite. Boredom, once absolute, now coexisted with desire. It had lost its monopoly on the table. This coexistence created a subtle transformation of culture. Eating was still a necessity, still an obligation, still framed by survival and hierarchy, but it had acquired a dimension of consciousness. Taste became a quiet battleground, a space where curiosity, imagination, and social awareness intersected. Even minor variations in cooking, the faint addition of herbs, the careful application of sugar, the adjustment of boiling times, were imbued with meaning. People became aware that food could differ, that meals could carry pleasure, and that life could, at least occasionally, be sweetened with attention to flavor. By the end of the medieval period, the stage was set for a profound gradual shift. Culinary boredom had served its purpose. It trained patience, honed attention, and created contrast. Without it, the coming waves of experimentation and delight would have lacked context, and flavor would have lost much of its impact. The recognition of monotony allowed imagination to flourish subtly, persistently, and irresistibly. The medieval table, with its gray breads, thick pottages, salted fish, and boiled meats, had endured centuries. It had survived scarcity, authority, tradition, and fear. Yet it had also taught people to notice, to remember, and to desire. In that quiet, almost imperceptible tension between endurance and imagination, boredom and curiosity, the medieval world prepared to step into an age where food would matter not just for survival, but for pleasure, identity, and culture. And as the hearths smoldered and the ovens cooled, one truth became clear. Even the dullest, most repetitive meals carried the seeds of transformation. In the gray monotony of medieval kitchens, change had already begun, waiting patiently, quietly, and irresistibly to awaken taste, to stir desire, and to redefine what it meant to eat. The medieval table was a paradox of endurance and anticipation. Day after day, the same ingredients, the same textures, the same smells, shaped the rhythm of life. Yet beneath the monotony, an undercurrent of desire persisted. People remembered the rare, the unusual, the fleeting moments when flavor broke through the gray. A single taste could linger for years, haunting memory, shaping expectation, and quietly altering perception. It was in these moments, when curiosity nudged the mind awake, when imagination brushed against reality, that the seeds of transformation truly took root. Consider bread, the most fundamental of all medieval foods. To the untrained eye, it was simple, a baked mixture of grain and water, sometimes salted, occasionally sweetened. But beneath that simplicity was an intricate network of tradition, economy, and subtle artistry. Grain was selected with care, if only the most basic. The milling process determined texture, which in turn shaped how the bread was consumed. Dense loaves were chewed slowly, filling the stomach, but rarely delighting the tongue. Softer loaves were prized, but rare, requiring skill, time, and resources most households lacked. Bakers, often tied to guild regulations, navigated this complexity daily, balancing tradition with innovation in ways that were invisible to most diners. Bread was sustenance, yes, but it was also a silent measure of skill, patience, and increasingly, taste. Pottage, the ubiquitous stew, tells a similar story. From a distance, it appeared monotonous, a grayish mass simmering endlessly over the fire. But within its depths, countless decisions shaped the meal. How long to boil the grains, whether to add a handful of herbs, how much water to leave in the pot, which scraps of meat or vegetables to include. these choices were rarely about flavor alone. They were practical, necessary, and constrained by scarcity. Yet they left a mark. 2 pots of pottage could taste very differently, even if they looked identical. The palate of the medieval diner, trained to endure, gradually became attentive, discerning, aware. People learned to notice slight differences, to favor one household's pottage over another, to remember which cook handled the ingredients with care. Monotony, once absolute, became a baseline from which novelty, however small, could emerge. Spices and imported ingredients, while rare and expensive, introduced another layer of complexity. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and sugar traveled from distant lands, often costing more than a day's labor. Their arrival did not revolutionize everyday meals overnight. Instead, they created moments of fascination, memory, and quiet desire. A pinch of pepper in a stew, a sprinkle of cinnamon on porridge, or a touch of sugar in a sauce could transform the familiar into something almost magical. For the common person, these ingredients were mostly imagined, described by travelers or merchants in stories that blended fact with fantasy. Yet, imagination has a flavor all its own. The mind's taste for novelty began to awaken even without direct experience. People became aware that food could be more than repetitive survival, that meals could carry pleasure, meaning, and even status. The awareness of potential variety slowly undermined the absolute authority of monotony. Tradition, religion, and guild regulations still enforced sameness, but memory and imagination offered subtle resistance. Patrons compared meals. Children remembered sweet treats and asked for them again. Urban kitchens experimented quietly, adding minor variations in herb, spice, or preparation. Monks and nuns, constrained by fasting rules, discovered ways to subtly enhance their restricted diets. The dull gray of daily meals was punctuated by these small sparks, almost imperceptible, but powerful. Even the physical act of eating began to shift. Plates, bowls, and utensils varied by region, subtly influencing taste perception. Dining in a noisy hall with companions heightened awareness of flavor, just as a quiet meal in solitude emphasized texture. The communal aspect of food, once purely practical, became a medium for comparison and subtle judgment. Diners began to recognize skill, care, and thoughtfulness, even in small dishes. Meals were no longer purely about nourishment. They became a space where subtle attention mattered, where the effort of the cook was appreciated, and where flavor, however restrained, could be noticed. By the end of the medieval period, the stage was set for a gradual but profound transformation. Food boredom, the enduring grayness of daily sustenance, had taught patience, endurance, and awareness. It had shaped the palate and trained the imagination to recognize difference. Memory, had amplified the impact of rare tastes, embedding desire deeply in the consciousness of diners, and curiosity, long restrained by necessity and authority, was growing steadily, quietly, and irresistibly. The final chapters of medieval food were not marked by feasts or grand culinary revolutions. They were marked by awareness, by subtle shifts in preparation, by careful experimentation with ingredients, by the growing recognition that even the simplest meals could be better, different, or more memorable. Boredom was no longer a passive condition. It had become a challenge, a catalyst, a guide. It had shaped the palate, the mind, and the culture of eating itself. And as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, as trade expanded and ideas traveled faster, the humble and monotonous foods of the past did not vanish. They evolved. Bread, pottage, and boiled meat persisted, but they now coexisted with new tastes, new textures, and new possibilities. The medieval table, once defined by endurance and predictability, became a platform for exploration, however cautious, however constrained. Boredom had done its work. It had trained people to notice, to imagine, and to desire. And in doing so, it had prepared Europe for a world where food would matter not just to the body, but to the mind and the spirit. Flavor, once rare and fleeting, would begin to shape culture itself, and the gray, dull meals of the past, far from being forgotten, would provide the contrast that made pleasure recognizable, meaningful, and profoundly transformative. The medieval age of food was ending, but the story it had written on the human palate would endure, carrying with it the lessons of monotony, the power of memory, and the quiet awakening of taste itself. It was a story of patience, resilience, and imagination, waiting for the world to catch up, and soon it would. As the medieval era drew to a close, the kitchens of Europe remained humble, smoky, and filled with the familiar rhythm of boiling, stirring, and baking. Yet a transformation, slow and almost imperceptible, had begun to ripple through the culture of eating. The ordinary meals of peasants, laborers, and even the lower nobility, once entirely defined by endurance, were now infused with small acts of choice, subtle experiments, and quiet memory. The gray monotony of daily bread and pottage, once so absolute that people scarcely noticed it, was now punctuated by the recognition that food could differ, that it could carry meaning beyond mere survival. People had begun to remember flavors, to crave small variations, and to imagine meals that might, one day, taste more vivid, more alive. Consider the stew, long the backbone of medieval sustenance. To the modern eye, it might seem bland, repetitive, and uninspired. But to those who ate it daily, it was a study in subtlety and restraint, the careful layering of ingredients, even when limited grains, a scrap of meat, a few greens, a pinch of herb created distinctions that sharpened the palate over years of repetition. A slight difference in boiling time, a change in the cut of vegetables, or the addition of a tiny amount of spice could transform an otherwise dull pot. Those who consumed these meals learned to notice, and noticing is the first step toward appreciation. Memory, imagination, and comparison worked quietly alongside necessity to awaken taste, even within the rigid boundaries of scarcity. Bread, ever present and often overlooked, carried similar lessons. Dense loaves of rye or wheat, coarse and heavy, required slow chewing and careful swallowing. Yet small differences, baker skill, water content, fermentation time, produced noticeable variations. Over time, people became attuned to these subtleties. Bread, once purely a fuel for survival, became a silent teacher, a medium through which endurance transformed into awareness. Patrons began to favor certain bakers, choosing not merely to fill their stomachs, but to experience a slightly better loaf. And in those small selections, the seeds of preference, and eventually of desire, took root. Spices and imported ingredients, still rare and expensive, continued to inspire awe and imagination. A pinch of cinnamon, a few threads of saffron, a sprinkle of sugar, each held immense symbolic and sensory weight. These flavors were rarely used freely. They were precious, employed sparingly to mark occasions or to honor guests. Yet even in their rarity, they had an outsized effect. Memory of these tastes lingered far longer than the flavor itself, shaping expectation and desire. The imagination filled in the gaps between ordinary meals, creating longing and curiosity. People began to understand that food could carry pleasure, status, and even identity. Authority, tradition, and morality still restrained the potential for culinary freedom. Religious fasting, guild regulations, and social hierarchy imposed boundaries. Excess was condemned, moderation was praised. But within these constraints, innovation quietly emerged. Cooks experimented with timing, combinations, and techniques that complied with rules while introducing subtle novelty. Patrons noticed, remembered, and compared. Even small improvements, slightly richer sauces, fresher herbs, better mixed grains, were celebrated quietly and influenced future practice. The dullness of medieval meals had not disappeared, but it was now negotiable, punctuated by deliberate, thoughtful deviations from routine. This slow awakening reshaped the relationship between people and the food they consumed. Meals were no longer only about survival. They became moments of observation, memory, and subtle pleasure. Boredom, once absolute, now coexisted with curiosity. Taste became something to recognize, to anticipate, and to seek. Even small households, limited by scarcity, began to show signs of this shift. Herbs grown in window boxes, tiny improvements in bread texture, careful preparation of vegetables, all demonstrated that attention and care could elevate the ordinary. Trade continued to accelerate these changes. Ingredients traveled farther, and awareness of possibilities spread wider. People began to imagine flavors from distant lands, even if they could not access them daily. Desire, once confined to occasional feasts or imagined stories, began to influence everyday choices. Patrons sought subtle improvements. Cooks learned to experiment cautiously. Authority adapted gradually, recognizing that rigid monotony was no longer sustainable in an increasingly connected world. By the close of the medieval period, the table had become a site of quiet transformation. Repetition and endurance still dominated, but memory, imagination, and attention had begun to fracture the absolute control of monotony. Meals still reflected scarcity, social hierarchy, and moral instruction. Yet they also carried potential for curiosity, for subtle enjoyment, and for the awakening of taste itself. People now understood that food could be more than survival. It could communicate care, skill, and even identity. It could evoke memory and desire. And most importantly, it could inspire change. The story of medieval food, long defined by endurance, ritual, and predictability, had reached a pivotal moment. The groundwork for the culinary evolution of the Renaissance was laid not in feasts or luxury, but in the quiet, patient observation of daily life. Boredom had taught endurance, honed attention, and sharpened memory. Scarcity had created contrast. Repetition had trained the imagination to recognize difference. And in the tension between what was and what could be, the first whispers of culinary curiosity were born. Change was coming, quietly, subtly, inexorably. The gray, heavy, monotonous meals of the past would persist for some time. But the awareness that food could be different, richer, more intentional, and more pleasurable had taken root. Medieval food, once defined by dullness, had transformed into a canvas for possibility. And in that transformation, the people of Europe were, unknowingly, preparing to taste the world anew. The medieval table, heavy with history, tradition, and monotony, had opened a door. Beyond it lay a future where food would no longer be endured. It would be experienced, imagined, and celebrated. And though the path forward was slow, uncertain, and uneven, the first steps had already been taken. Quietly simmering in kitchens, market stalls, and hearths across the continent, waiting to awaken the senses and transform the very act of eating. As the medieval era faded and the dawn of the Renaissance approached, the landscape of European food was both familiar and subtly transformed. Kitchens remained smoky, heavy with the smell of boiled grains, roasted bones, and the occasional sweetened ale. The staple dishes, pottage, coarse bread, salted fish, boiled greens, and tough meats, still dominated daily life for most people. Yet within this sameness, the subtle shifts that had been gathering over decades, even centuries, began to coalesce into a quiet revolution. People were no longer entirely passive consumers of food. They noticed, remembered, compared, and imagined. Monotony, once an unquestioned virtue, had begun to erode under the combined influence of memory, curiosity, and subtle innovation. The medieval diner had become, in effect, a silent critic. Even peasants, constrained by scarcity, could recognize slight differences in taste and texture. A loaf baked with extra care, a pottage simmered just long enough to release the faintest flavor of herbs, a pinch of spice added discreetly. All these small deviations created a growing awareness of what food could be. Memory amplified the impact. One rare treat could be remembered for years, becoming a standard against which all other meals were measured. This awareness, though quiet and often private, seeded a collective imagination. People began to expect more from what they ate, even if they could rarely access it. In urban centers, where markets were larger and trade more active, this shift was most visible. Bakers experimented subtly with grain mixtures, shapes, and fermentation, creating breads that differed slightly from day to day. Brewers refined their ales, adjusting recipes to balance flavor, clarity, and strength. Tavern owners, competing for customers, introduced minor innovations: sweetened pies, roasted nuts, spiced wines that punctuated monotony and offered fleeting moments of delight. Patrons noticed and remembered, and over time, small preferences influenced broader practices. Taste had become a quiet form of social power, shaping demand and guiding experimentation, even within strict limits. Among the wealthy, the story was more complex. Noble households continued to feast in ways designed to impress and assert status. Yet even there, boredom persisted. Masses of spiced meats, heavily sauced dishes, and elaborate presentations often overwhelmed the palate. Yet memory, curiosity, and subtle skill could transform these excesses into nuanced experiences. A carefully prepared sauce, a delicately roasted meat, or a rare exotic ingredient could captivate diners accustomed to indulgence without pleasure. Boredom, though still present, was now negotiable, punctuated by moments of awareness and enjoyment that left lasting impressions. The church and medical authorities, long arbiters of taste and moderation, adapted slowly. Fasting rules remained, and moral guidance still emphasized restraint. But interpretation became more flexible. Monks and nuns experimented quietly with herbs, bread, and ale, while physicians began to recognize that a moderate enjoyment of food could coexist with health and virtue. Even moral and medical authority, once a rigid force enforcing monotony, began to acknowledge subtle variation, whether in preparation, seasoning, or presentation. Authority no longer monopolized the palate. It had to share it with imagination and memory. Trade continued to expand possibilities. Spices, sugar, rice, and dried fruits, while still rare for most, became more accessible in urban areas and noble households. Even the awareness of these ingredients, through stories and imagination, influenced desire and expectation. People began to understand that flavor could be intentional, controlled, and pleasurable. Meals were no longer purely functional. They were becoming experiences, however modest, that could inspire memory, curiosity, and anticipation. By the end of the medieval period, the act of eating had shifted from endurance to awareness. Food remained simple for most, repetitive for many, and constrained by tradition, authority, and scarcity. But boredom, once total and unquestioned, had become a quiet teacher. It trained patience, sharpened perception, and heightened appreciation for difference. No matter how small, memory amplified rare pleasures. Imagination filled the gaps between meals, and curiosity began to influence choice, however cautiously. The dull gray of medieval tables was no longer absolute. It had been punctuated with subtle sparks that hinted at what was possible. This transformation, slow and imperceptible, set the stage for the future. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on exploration, discovery, and artistry, would bring more dramatic changes to European cuisine. Ingredients, techniques, and ideas would travel faster and further. Recipes would become more elaborate, flavors more daring, and presentation more intentional. Yet none of this would have been possible without the foundation built by centuries of boredom, endurance, and quiet observation. The medieval table had trained minds to notice, taste to differentiate, and imagination to aspire. Without the gray monotony of the past, the pleasures of the future would have been meaningless. And so, the story of boring medieval food ends not with a feast or a flourish, but with awareness, a subtle, patient, and powerful awakening of taste. In the smoke-filled kitchens, in the humble hearths, in the crowded marketplaces and grand halls, people learned to notice difference, to appreciate skill, and to imagine pleasure. They discovered that food could be more than survival, that it could carry memory, meaning, and desire. The medieval table had endured for centuries, shaping lives, reinforcing authority, and teaching patience. But by the end of the period, it had done more. It had prepared Europe to taste the world differently, to imagine, to desire, and to create. Boring medieval food, in all its gray monotony, had accomplished the impossible. It had trained an entire continent to notice flavor, to remember it, and to long for it. And in that quiet, patient transformation, the seeds of culinary freedom were planted, ready to grow, to flourish, and to transform every meal that followed, one mindful bite at a time.